is from Sask Power, who will start the presentation. Scott is the Director of Planning and Rate Design for Sask Power, and I would like to invite Scott to the podium, and he can, when he is done, he can introduce his other personnel who will be making the presentation. Scott?
Thank you, Al. So we're here today to review Sask Power's rate application for 2022 and 2023. But before we get into the details, while the rate review panel is hosting today's meeting, Sask Power does have a tradition to recognize our commitment to safety, where anytime we're presenting to a group of 5 or more, we start the meeting with a safety moment. So here's just a bit of an update or some guidance around nighttime driving in Saskatchewan. So you should use your high beams at night on roads not lit by street lamps. You must dim your headlights at least 200 meters in advance of oncoming vehicles and keep them dim until the vehicle has passed. So as a rule of thumb, if you're traveling 100 kilometers an hour, this means you should dim your lights when the oncoming vehicle is roughly 8 to 12 seconds away. Keep your headlights on low beam when being passed until passing the vehicle is at least 100 meters away. And then finally, there's no need to dim headlights on divided highways if roadways are 22 meters or more apart. In Al's opening, he recognized the treaty and land that we're on today, but we too would acknowledge that we live and work on the treaty and traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. We respect and honor the treaties that were made and are committed to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So we've broken today's presentation down into a couple of sections. I'm going to start by just going kind of through the nuts and bolts of the financial overview. So specifically, what rate increase is Sask Power asking for? What's changed since our last application? Why do we need this rate increase? And then I'll end it by providing a bit of an overview as to what our financial outlook looks like over the next couple of years. I'll then turn it over to Rod McCrory, who will walk us through 2 other components of this rate application, the first being rate rebalancing, and then finally our rate redesign approach, which is really geared towards our demand-metered customers. So in terms of what we're asking for, we're looking at a system average rate increase of 4% effective September 1st of 2022, and an additional 4% effective April 1st, 2023. In terms of what that means for our average customers, for residential customers, it works out to about a $5 a month increase, and for farm customers, roughly $12 a month. Again, as part of this rate application and as part of typical maintenance, the way our rates are laid out, we are requesting rate rebalancing, and again, for those demand-metered customers, a revision to the rate redesign. So what's changed since our last application? The answer is a number of things, but we've kind of narrowed it down to these 3. The first being the federal carbon tax. So beginning in 2019, our customers began paying the federal carbon tax, shown as a separate rate rider on your bill. Second is our emission reduction requirements. Now, Sask Power has kind of looked at and monitored our emission approach or emission requirements for the last number of years and has committed to a 50% reduction below 2005 levels by the year 2030. However, this is becoming a very evolving world, and even within the last federal announcements, different approaches of achieving net zero are being looked at, 2050, and the latest is 2035. And then finally, the impacts of COVID-19. Obviously, there's been a number of impacts that have impacted Sask Power, but also it's no different than for any of our customers. So Sask Power has been able to avoid having a rate increase since 2018. And there's been a few factors that have contributed to us being in this position. So first of all, we have benefited quite significantly from low natural gas prices over the last number of years. The second one is our hydroelectric generation. And just to give you a little bit of context, so the last fiscal year, so ending March 2021, we were able to generate roughly 632 gigawatt hours more hydro generation than what we had budgeted. Hydro generation is the cheapest form of electricity, and so it goes a long way to minimizing your fuel and purchase power costs. On the flip side, in our current fiscal year, we're actually 23% below median, meaning 855 gigawatts of generation that was assumed to come from hydro now has to be made up from other generation sources. In the rate application years, we continue to assume median hydro levels, and then we determine those impacts, whether we're going to go over or under those levels as we progress through the year. Interest rates. So lots in the news recently about if and when the Bank of Canada and other banks will begin raising rates, but we have been able to benefit from this low interest rate environment for the last number of years. We are anticipating that changing and it ultimately having additional cost pressures on the company. Internal efficiencies. There's been a number of approaches or programs that SaskPower has looked at. We've kind of come up with a few and referred to them as our business optimization program. We've set savings targets internally just to try to give each of the business areas targets on their OM&A budgets to shoot for. On top of that, today even we're continuing to look at ways of streamlining our workforce, making them as efficient as possible, and we're also collaborating with other Crown corporations in an attempt to not only find savings at SaskPower, but right across the full Crown sector. And then finally, and we'll see this a little bit later on, even though we haven't had a rate increase, we also haven't achieved our targeted return on equity. And really what that means is that we have ended up settling for a lower net income than what we initially target. So what is driving this rate increase? So if we focus in on SaskPower's expenses, we like to refer to them in three broad categories. So the first one is our capital-related expenses, and the biggest component there is our depreciation expense. So as we continue to build assets and spend money on capital, you then begin to amortize that over the life of the asset. And the second one is our interest expense. We end up borrowing money almost every year to fund that capital program. And it kind of goes back to what I was mentioning earlier, is that we have been able to refinance some much higher interest-paying debt over the last few years, some in the range of 9 to 10% interest rates, and we've refinanced that at rates in the range of 3%. And so what you can see in this graph is that, in fact, over the period beginning in 2018-19 through to the final period in this rate application, which is 23-24, we're anticipating our capital-related expenses to actually drop a little bit. The second category is our OM&A. Now, OM&A stands for Operating, Maintenance, Administration. So those are really our people costs, whether they're SaskPower employees, whether they're contractors or consultants. Those are the costs of people doing work at SaskPower. And you can see here that over that same span, I didn't write the exact number down, but it's in the neighborhood of about $55 million increase over that 6-year period. Now, when we kind of dig into what's driving that variance, when we think of our core costs, so again, that's the biggest part is being our people costs, our salaries and benefits. We've maintained or managed to hold that line relatively flat. And where we're seeing these cost increases is more along the lines of special initiatives that are required and are basically required to position ourselves for more success in the future. So a couple of those is our vegetation management spend. So back in 18-19, we spent around $12 million, and by 23-24, we'll be increasing that annual spend by about $20 million. There's something referred to as cloud costs, and so it's something that a lot of us take for granted. In the past, when you'd be buying computer systems and hardware and the servers, the accounting guidelines would say that can be treated as a capital cost and then depreciated. And in fact, as technology changes and we begin to move to more of a cloud environment, the rules change a little bit on how you do the accounting for those transactions. And essentially, now rather than having it flow through your depreciation expense, it now hits your OM&A. The last one I'd mention is the work being done on our small modular reactor feasibility work. This is something relatively new, but by the end of this rate application, we'll be looking at that contributing somewhere in the neighborhood of $14 to $20 million of our OM&A spend. So really, when we're looking at these drivers behind our OM&A, it's a lot of these additional factors that are getting on top or placed on top of our existing budgets that is really causing that increase. And then by far the biggest line is on our fuel and purchase power. And there's two key drivers to this. The first is that we continue to add new renewable generation to our grid. And I'll have a little bit more on that later. And then second, I think anybody that's been kind of tuning on to, whether it's gas prices or natural gas prices, we are seeing definite cost pressures in that category. And so specifically on our fuel and purchase power costs for this year, we are seeing significantly higher gas prices. It's roughly about $1.10 per GJ, 18-19 compared to what we're projecting right now. So a little bit more on the generating options. So I mentioned that we've been adding renewable generation to our grid. Within this last fiscal year, we added 400 megawatts of renewable generation. The two biggest being 200 megawatts of our Golden South wind energy facility and another 175 at our Blue Hill wind energy facility. So that's wind generation. Now, most of this wind, or most of our renewable generation, is added through the form of independent power producers. And again, when we're looking at how the costs show up in SaskPower's financial statements, what's a little bit different than, say you've got a more traditional gas plant is that when you're building a gas plant, you're going to have capital costs, you're going to have fuel costs, you're going to have people costs to run that plant, you're going to have some other maintenance costs. But when we look at specifically renewables in the form of wind generation, the way those IPPs are laid out is that it's just strictly a fuel cost. And so just to kind of give you a little bit of context of the comparisons, as we add more renewable, you'll see that those costs hit our fuel budgets. And then lastly, and just a note on intermittent versus baseload. So wind and solar are considered intermittent generation. And what that means is, on a windy day or on a sunny day, you can count on that generation. But, at times on our coldest of cold or our hottest or hot days, sometimes that wind isn't blowing. Or sometimes the sun is so hot that it's tripping the panels. And so that's referred to as intermittent generation. On the flip side, something like hydroelectric imports from Manitoba, that is something that can be more counted on as base load. So a little bit of a difference between those two types of renewable generation. So in terms of electricity demand, there's a number of things going on this slide. But just for your information, when we're looking at the blue bars, what those are reflecting is our energy sales on an annual basis. And so starting in 2014, you can see a relative, for the most part, consistent increase right through to 2018-19. That worked out to be about 2.6% load growth per annum over that period. Then in 1920, SaskPower actually saw about a 2.1% decline in our sales volumes, and a lot of that was driven by activities in our power class. You can see in fiscal 21, really that drop there, which is 3%, is more or less attributed to the impacts of COVID. So when the first 3 months of the pandemic hit, SaskPower sales volumes were down more than double digits in each of those 3 months. But then as the year progressed, began to recover. And so that brings us to the first column that's shaded in a lighter shade of blue, which is our current year forecast. It's a relative good news story. What it shows is that our recovery is happening perhaps even a little bit quicker than expected. Our load growth is year over year forecasted to be about 5.5% higher than where we were at the end of 2021. But one thing of note, and you can see it quite clearly in this graph, is that if you were to compare the bar for 2018-19 to where it is in 21-22, you can see that despite this 5.5% recovery this year, we're still more or less kind of back to where we were in 2018-19. The second line, indicated by the orange line, is reflecting our annual peak. So that's typically driven by, on the coldest day, on the shortest day of the year, how much peak energy did SaskPower have to provide. And again, kind of through that trending 2014 through to 2021, it typically grew in line with where we saw our sales growth, and then it plateaued. And one thing of note in 21-22 is we hit a new peak this year. And so, in fact, we hit 2 new peaks. The first one was on December 29th of 2021, and then the very next day, we hit another peak. And so again, keep in mind, it's the days are short, it's extremely cold out, and that's typically what drives SaskPower's peak. What we'll be doing in future load forecasts is revisiting, this peak and the factors that contributed to it, and we'll be revising our estimated peaks going forward. So really, this is the last slide within the financial section, and it's meant to kind of summarize a lot of the things that we were talking about here. We've got kind of 6 years of information, but I thought I'd only focus in on the 3 columns on the farthest right. So the first being what we're forecasting for this current fiscal year, 21-22. So these numbers came right out of the rate application. We wanted to try to keep them consistent here. But being that we're at April 5th, the fiscal year has closed, and SaskPower is currently in the process of working through our year-end processes and determining what our final net income was for the year. I think what we've seen in these last few months, again, largely driven by these rising natural gas prices, is that net income projection of $10 million might be a little bit optimistic, but again, we will kind of know those numbers and be able to incorporate them into a mid-application update. The second year I wanted to focus in on was the 22-23 projections, where we're looking at a net income of $33 million, which will generate a return on equity of 1.1%. And again, the 4% rate increase that is, our rate application is based on, is factored into those numbers, assumed to come online September 1st. And so even with that 4% increase, SaskPower is looking at a $33 million net income. And again, finally, when you move it forward to the final year of the application, you can see that net income grows to $109 million, achieving a return on equity of 3.8%. So I think I'm going to pause there, and we'll check and see if there were any questions from those in attendance or if there were any that came through. I'm seeing nothing online, and we've also got microphones at the podium, and I think I'll call Rod up, and then, once Rod's gone through the rate rebalancing and rate design sections, then we're happy to take any questions that come thereafter.
I guess for the record, Dave Kay with Synovus in Lloydminster. So some questions in reading this. The hedging of gas, do you still hedge gas, and how much gas do you have hedged going in the future?
So we do still have hedges in place, but in 2019, SaskPower essentially paused their hedging program. But it is something that we're kind of reviewing again presently, and are looking at taking something back to our board of directors early in the next fiscal year.
So you're paying market price for gas more or less today?
Yeah, I don't have those numbers in front of me, but I believe we're looking at roughly 35 to 40% of our gas is currently hedged. It'd be a little less in the following year. So there are still a number of hedges in place, but obviously for the remainder, it's based more on today's market prices.
Okay. And then you do talk about the carbon tax, and the carbon tax is essentially should be a flow-through and not part of the rate. I think you say that in here quite a bit. I did notice, I couldn't find it in this, but online I've looked at and I see your forecast for carbon price for the next few years.
Yeah, so the carbon tax is currently based on a $50 per ton for the calendar year of 2022. And then going forward, that tax is going to increase by $15 a ton. And so if you were to look through the application, you would see some slight variances assumed between how much SaskPower collects versus how much the expense is. And there's a few reasons for that. Part of it is just due to there was a bit of a surplus position at the end of this year, and so we're able to apply that into future years, which kind of causes some of the mismatch between the expense and the revenue.
Yes, I noticed that as well. But my question is, as going forward, as you put more renewables online, the carbon tax should drop on a per kilowatt basis, should it not, when you're using,
Well,
when coal drops off?
In theory, yes. The challenge becomes twofold. The tax itself continues to increase, and as far as we know right now, it peaks at $170 a ton in 2030. The second piece is that on our coal generation, for example, there are certain thresholds that are set, and every year that threshold declines. And so what that means is you're given a certain credit for the amount of emissions that you can produce before the carbon tax is applied. But for every year, that threshold is reduced. And so you end up paying more tax on those same amount of emissions.
Okay, thanks. But on the other side, while the carbon tax does not go to rate base, you are installing renewables and gas and replacement of coal to manage carbon, to reduce your carbon costs. Those do go into rate base and become part of the rate application or rate increase. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. That's what I thought. And how about carbon liabilities from PPAs, from third-party suppliers of power? Are they included in the cost here, or where are they included in? Or are they included at all?
So I'm sorry, carbon emissions from?
Yeah, you mentioned in here that you buy power from third parties under power purchase agreements.
Yeah, so.
And some of those are gas-fired.
Yeah, and So the numbers that you see in here are SAS Power's generating units. The companies that we produce or purchase power from, they administer the carbon tax programs on their end.
But I understand that they have to transfer under the new electrical regulations, transfer the carbon to you folks as a liability so that they're held neutral. There's usually a change in law clause in those contracts.
Dave, this might be a good one. We'll take it back, and if you'd like to ask this one as kind of through the panel's website, then we can kind of reach out to our experts in the field and kind of get you a formal answer on that one.
Okay. That's it for now.
Okay, thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Scott. Just get myself organized here a little bit. Okay, so thank you very much, and I certainly do appreciate the opportunity to discuss our rate rebalancing and rate design strategies that we're undertaking for this application, as it's quite often one of the most misunderstood aspects of a rate application. So before I can talk about rebalancing, I need to discuss something called revenue to revenue requirement ratios, and we're going to keep this at as high a level as we can. A revenue to revenue requirement ratio is essentially the criteria that we use to measure cross-subsidization. And it's a commonly used metric throughout the industry. It's sometimes referred to as a revenue to cost ratio in other jurisdictions, but it essentially means the same thing. What it is it's the revenue that we have collected from a customer class on an annual basis divided by the total amount of required revenue to serve that customer class on an annual basis. So the revenue divided by the revenue requirement, and it's quite often expressed as a decimal or as a percentage. So if you have a revenue to revenue requirement ratio of 1, the class is paying its fair share or 100% of the cost to serve. If you're slightly below 1 or if you're below 1, you're receiving a subsidy from other classes. And if you are above 1, you are providing a subsidy to other classes. And any subsidies provided to a particular customer or class are paid for by all other customers. And this is important when we talk about cost of service and a zero-sum process, is that if you think of a utilities revenue requirement as a pie, and if I cut off a smaller piece of the pie for somebody, that means by default, everybody else has to take a slightly larger piece of the pie. So that's what's happening there. Utilities attempt to set their revenue to revenue requirement ratios between a bandwidth of 0.95 to 105 or 95% to 105. We do this because there are fluctuations and uncertainty inherent in any cost of service study that's conducted. So the industry consensus is that there's no material levels of cross-subsidization as long as the customer class ratios are falling between that 95 to 105. So the industry standard is 95 to 105. There are some jurisdictions that have a little wider bandwidth, no more than 0.91 or 0.90 to 1.1. And SAS Power traditionally SAS Power has set its revenue to revenue requirement ratio bandwidth between 0.98 and 102, and indicating that we have among the lowest levels of cross-subsidization in Canada. With this application, as we'll discuss a little bit later on, we've decided to be a little bit more flexible in the application of that 98 to 102, given some of the circumstances that we've experienced. But it is still our long-term goal to get all of our customer classes between that very narrow bandwidth. So what rate rebalancing really is it's the process of adjusting our rates so that the revenues that we collect from customers more closely align with their revenue requirement. So rate rebalancing is very important to a utility because these ratios tend to deteriorate without regular maintenance. In other words, ratios are quite dynamic. They fluctuate every year. We conduct a cost of service study, and this is due to changes in the customer's revenue. So if their load profile changes, either up or down, or their revenue requirement fluctuates, either due to changes in cost of service methodology or a non-uniform escalation of SAS Power's costs. So they're quite dynamic. They move around every year, and if we don't have the opportunity to rebalance, the bandwidth of the ratios can begin to spread further and further apart, which makes it more difficult for a utility to get them back into alignment. And normally, in the past, SAS Power would fully rebalance our rates in a single application. We would simply just move everybody back into that 98 to 102. But with this rate application, we've adopted a longer-term approach to rebalancing its rates. And we're doing this to help mitigate the potential impacts to customers due to the fact that it's been 4 years since we've had a rate application. We haven't increased our rates since 2018. There's a lot of ongoing technological advancements that are affecting our industry right now. The barriers to entry for self-generation are coming down. There's ongoing electrification of the grid in terms of electric vehicles and electrification of heat. So we're hesitant to bring all these rates back into that narrow bandwidth, only to maybe have to reverse that trend. We haven't rebalanced our rates since 2015, so as I've expressed before, as the ratios begin to deteriorate and pull further apart, it can be harder and harder to get them back into alignment, so we've taken a longer-term strategy with that. And of course, a shift in rate design, which we will discuss later. So given all of these factors, we believe that utilizing more discretion within the 0.95 to 105 range is warranted. So what does this look like? What does it actually mean? So this is actually, this slide shows the proposed rate rebalancing strategy for the 2022-2023 application. You can see the beginning ratios on the left-hand column there, on the left side right there. That's our start point. And so what happens with a revenue change is that everybody gets, if we're going for a 4% revenue lift, everybody gets 4%. Every class gets 4%. Then there is a rate rebalancing adjustment in the column beside it that is a slight increase or a slight decrease. That indicates our efforts to get the ratios back into alignment. So what people see is the total rate change of 4.2 for residentials and farms. So what's really important to point out here is that the rate rebalancing impact at the very bottom is 0. In other words, rate rebalancing is revenue neutral to SAS Power. We do not profit from it. We still get our 4% at the end of the day. That's what our revenue lift is. It's just we've made slight adjustments up or down to the customer classes in order to get to a revenue requirement of 1 and a 4% rate increase. So that's basically a breakdown of what's happening. Everybody gets 4%, plus or minus a little bit for rebalancing maintenance, and then you see the impacts to each class. So what does this mean for customers? And this is what Scott had kind of alluded to or shown earlier in his presentation. For residentials and farm customers, for the 2023 rate increase for rates effective September 1st, 2022, if approved, the average residential customer will see an increase of $5 per month to their bill. Farms will receive an average increase of $12 per month. And of course, for 2024, for rates effective April 1st, 2023, you can see the same thing. Residential customers will receive an additional $5 per customer per month. Farms are $12 per customer per month. But what's really kind of important here is that you can already see some of the impacts of our rebalancing initiatives here. The farms, you can start to see that the ratios are starting to move back into alignment very slowly. They're not back at 98 to 102 just yet, but you can start to see by the second year of the application that the rates, the bandwidth is getting narrower and narrower between customer classes. Okay, so that's it for that, and we'll just move along into rate redesign. So this is a representation of SAS Power's current rate designs and how they're performing. So on the left-hand side, this is how SAS Power accounts for its costs. So 70% of SAS Power's costs that it incurs on an annual basis are fixed, and 30% are variable. So 70% of our costs, we incur these costs whether we are producing electricity or not. So that's the plants and the wires and the poles and the transformers. The 30% variable cost is fuel and a little bit of labor associated with the generation of electricity. So that's how SAS Power books its costs on the accounting side. But on the revenue side, how we recover those costs through our rates, it's almost a complete reversal of how we account for costs versus how we recover them. Now, we're only collecting 22% of our fixed costs through our rates, and that's through the basic monthly charges and our demand. And 78% of our revenue is recovered through the energy charge, which is tied to consumption. So the majority of our revenue is collected through volumetric charges, and this is reflective of the current rate designs that embeds a significant portion of our fixed costs into the energy component of the rate. So what happens is there's a substantial amount of fixed costs are at risk, about 48%, when a customer reduces their energy consumption due to self-generation. And those costs, those stranded costs, therefore have to be absorbed by our remaining customers on the system. So we want to change to a conventional rate design because our current rates are sending a distorted price signal to customers regarding SaskPower's true costs for providing demand and energy services. Our current energy charges are overstated. Our current demand charges are understated. And so so what we want to do is we want to correct the price signal to send the right signal to customers who are considering self-generation. The other reason why is that conventional rate design is common amongst most electric utilities in North America. So I believe there are 2 utilities in Canada that use the same methodology that we use, so we are by no means an island doing this by ourselves. There are others, but the majority of utilities in North America have adopted this approach of a conventional or cost-based rate design. And a recent review by a third-party consultant confirms that SaskPower should revert to a conventional rate design. And just as another point, converting to a conventional rate design will eventually facilitate the unbundling of rates if required as our market changes, as the electrical market changes. We can't currently unbundle our demand charge because there's a significant piece of those costs embedded in the energy charge, so we can't unbundle it until we move those costs back. So what are the impacts of moving to a conventional rate design? Well, very simply is that energy charges will decrease and the demand charges will increase. And those customers who use energy less efficiently on our system will generally pay more, and those who are more efficient will generally pay less. So if we have a customer who has a nice steady load, they're using energy quite consistently, they're probably going to be okay. They're going to see maybe a bit of a reduction. However, if you're quite sporadic on the system, if you incur high demands relative to low energy, you're generally going to have to pay more, or you will pay more. It's very important to point out, as Scott mentioned earlier, that this change in the rate redesign only affects demand-metered customers, or those customers who are assessed demand charges, and that's 4% of our customers. And we are expecting to take approximately, well, it'll take several applications in order to complete this transition to a conventional rate design. And that's it for me. Are there any questions? Come on up.
Sorry, I'm back to carbon tax.
Oh, okay.
I noticed that the carbon tax on page 21 is included in your expenses.
It is included in the expenses. It is not included in the cost of service.
Okay.
So there's a separate report that was filed with the panel with our minimum filing requirements that shows that we have any revenues or any expenses associated with the carbon tax have been removed from the rate base. So they're not included.
Yeah, my concern is it shows up on the bottom line as total expenses by year. And the carbon tax between 2022 and 24, you've got it going up 44%, which is kind of skews what your expense costs may go, because they're just a pass-through, are they not?
Yes.
The customer just pays you for them.
Yeah.
So Dave, maybe I'll chime in there too. So on page 19 of the rate application, you'll actually see the revenues are also shown as a separate line. So we do show both the revenue and the expenses within the application, but to your point, they're meant to more or less balance each other out.
So near the top of the page under 7.1, the federal charge for carbon tax, which is lower than what you show as an expense, which is part of the rebalancing problem you've got.
Well, not the rebalancing that Ron was referring to.
No, not that.
Just the
Balancing income against expenses, yeah. Oh, yeah, the switching between demand and energy, changing that structure. The plant I run is 90%, over 90% on a load factor. But there was a sheet in here, I can't find it right now, that says what my cost of power should be when I'm running 90% as a power class. And my cost of power is not that low on a per kilowatt basis without carbon tax. So but I'm willing to talk to somebody or try to get a
Yeah,
better idea on why that doesn't match my calculations.
And you ran it through the proposed rates that SaskPower is, like, when you did your analysis? did
No,
you-
I just, in here, there's a sheet that says if you're a power class customer, a high load factor and low load factor, and a high load factor, I think the example is 90% load factor.
Okay,
And the cost per kilowatt might be 7.5 cents a kilowatt hour
okay,
between demand and energy.
okay.
Now I didn't change the rates, but my present cost is higher than that. So you're telling me that my cost per kilowatt hour is going to drop?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yep. A conventional rate design, like our current rates already reward customers who have higher load factors, who use the system more efficiently. A conventional rate design will actually accelerate that for you. It actually gives you more of a benefit. So if you are at a 90% load factor, yes, I would say that you will definitely save some money with this.
So about 20 years ago, it was like that?
Yes.
And you switched
Well,
to lower the demand and raise the energy?
yes, yeah,
Now you're going backwards?
Yeah, in 2001, like we had a cost of service review in 1997, and it was recommended that we make this change. And so we had a moratorium on rates from 96 to 2000, so we couldn't do anything. And then in 2001, we made the change where we embedded the demand costs, and so we lowered the demand and increased the energy based on those recommendations. And now, you're right, that's all we're doing is we're simply going back to what we were doing 20 plus years ago.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? No? I think so.
I understand there's no other questions online. I would like to thank you for coming out tonight and participating. And I would just, again, like to thank Scott and Rod for their presentations tonight. And I will just say a few words about the panel's role and how this public meeting and other things will be used by the panel. The panel is directed by an order of the minister in charge of Crown Investments Corporation and SaskPower to do a review of the rate application put forward by SaskPower. Although there are several terms in the document, basically we are to provide the minister with our opinion on the fairness of the proposed rate application under a number of different criteria, including the interests of SaskPower, the interests of the public, and the customers. As we, as citizens of Saskatchewan, all have a vested interest in SaskPower. We must also consider the relevant industry standards as well as the proposed rates competitiveness with neighboring jurisdictions. Part of our mandate is to seek input from the public and from stakeholders in general. We have done so by asking the public to comment through our website, through emails, and also by phone messages. Through these means, we have already received some responses and some with detailed information. And our plan is to complete our review, taking into account all of these responses, as well as these presentations and others, and any other communications that we will receive up to our deadline, which is May the 3rd. So there's still a month to go, pretty much, for you to make known your views on this application. In the meantime, we will be working with our consultants to come up with our report to the minister towards a final deadline of July the 11th when our report will be made public. In the meantime, you can go to our website, saskratereview.ca, to monitor all the questions that have been posed to Sask Power and their responses. I would like to thank you again for coming out, and please have a safe drive home. Thank you very much.